Now, in this lesson, we are going to look at one of our last optimizations, and it's going to be another hook. So in the last lesson, we learned about our use callback hook. But in this lesson, what we're going to learn about is the use memo hook. And use memo is very similar to use callback in both the format that it's used, but also in its conceptualization of when to use it. The only thing about use memo is that you actually use it when you want to cache the value of a function that does something complex. So what do I mean by this? Well, as we know with use callback now, what use callback does is it essentially wraps a function and memoizes it so that if none of the dependencies that this function depends on changes, we always get back a cached, memoized version of the function. Whereas use memo is going to be called in a similar manner as use callback. So let me show you. So I have the hook imported from React. And what I do is I wrap this function called do something complicated. And it might just be something that's computationally expensive, like some intense math, for example. This isn't even that complex, but imagine if it was something that is very expensive for the browser to do. For us to run it every time, it's something that takes a lot of browser's performance power in order to do. So in a situation like this, where we see that we are displaying the output of this do something complicated, which is some kind of value, what happens is that, let's say we increase the count. So this computes that new value every time we increase count, which is expected because count1 is a dependency inside of the output of this function. But what happens when we input count2? We see that our function is still firing, which, as we learned in the last lesson, is because we inline this function. And whenever our component re-renders, this function is getting called and regenerated every single time. Now, what we want to do is actually not recompute this value every time we re-render the component. This takes a step beyond just memoizing the function. We actually want to memoize the output of the function, because performing the function itself is also computationally expensive. So what we do with use memo is we actually are able to get the returned value of this function and then cache that value and use it instead of invoking the function instead. So let's just actually do it. So in order to use it, we're going to wrap this function inside of use memo. And just like use callback, we're going to pass it an array as the second argument that is also the dependencies that it relies on. Now, because we are passing count1 inside of this function, we do need to make sure that we do keep count1 here as well, which means that this function will only ever recompute when the count1 value changes. So now, instead of using do something complicated as a function, it is simply a value that actually will be invoked when our JavaScript evaluates this line 12 when it's going through our code. It's going to see the use memo hook, and it's going to say, okay, what they want to do is they want me to memoize the output of this function. So that's what it'll do. It'll compute the value of this function once it has to actually evaluate this value. And then whenever we use it, it's just going to use the cache value. Even when we re-render our component, as long as count1 has not changed, it's just going to continue to use that memoized value. You can kind of see this like our selectors, in the sense that our selectors also memoize the values until the prompts going into them have changed. So now what we'll see is that we have our initial I am computing something complex. If we update count1, we are of course going to refire and regenerate that function value because count1 has changed, and count1, as we know, is a dependency of this do something complicated function call. So we're going to see it again. But now, whenever I reinstantiate and re-update the state of my component and re-render this component, you'll see that the function doesn't fire. This is because now this value has been memoized. So that's the main difference between when we use memo and when we use callback. We want to use callback when we simply want a memoized function, and we use memo when we want a memoized value. And we only want a memoized value when the function itself is generally going to be very computationally expensive. So hopefully, with that, you're now equipped with the 2 new hooks that help us make our code more performant. And with that, you are now fully equipped with a lot of the tools required to understand how to optimize the performance of your components and your functions inside of your React code. And always remember, the times to use these tools will always depend on the context of the problem you're trying to solve. And you always want to encounter the optimization problem first before you start actually optimizing your code.